Born to Annoy, The Dawning of Awareness, Chapter 14, The World of Work. Noise, an incessant banging, tapping, rhythmic cacophony of background noise. The hum of machine tools, a beating of hammers, the crackle and pop of oxyacetylene welding, a ringing of spanners, a growl of overhead cranes, a grinding of steel, the whine and hoot of electric trucks, shouty snatches of conversation, sporadic singing, muttered curses, intermittent whistling, the sounds of a factory, a hive of industry, the noise of the collective and precisely coordinated skillful toil of hundreds of labouring men and women, producing useful and much-needed equipment, contributing to the wealth and well-being of the nation. This, above all else, was my first impression, as I walked for the first time through the double doors into the strange but warm embrace of the large and lofty premises of Associated Electrical Industries in Higher Openshaw. As I write this, it is almost 51 years to the month when I made my first walk into the works. I remember it as if it was yesterday. I can still smell the distinctive scent of the lubricating coolant dripping onto the tips of cutting tools in the machine shop. My mind's eye can still conjure up the bright blue-white flashes of welding in the fabrication department, and wonder at the degree of concentration on the faces of marker-outs, accurately and speedily centre-popping the position of holes to be drilled in the sheets of steel destined to become switchgear control panels. I can still sense the warm, honest, welcoming camaraderie of workers united in the process of production and engaged in the task of winning bread for their families and themselves. Following a brief period in the apprentice training school, I was set to work in the capstan lathe section of the machine shop, producing screwed rod, studs, nuts, bolts and washers. The company paid me a basic wage of £2.14 and sixpence, for which I was grateful, and in return they expected me to work for 42 hours a week, and to make them a profit in the process. They also expected me to provide them with credit, for, as they informed me at the outset, they would only pay me my week's wage once I had completed 2 weeks' production for them. In my innocence, because my employers had agreed to provide me with a practical training to enable me to acquire useful skills, as well as paying me a wage, I presumed they were my benefactors. It didn't take long for Maggie Bradshaw to enlighten me and show that the precise opposite was true. I, like the rest of my class, was in point of fact their benefactor. Maggie was the lathe operator responsible for my education in the fine arts of metal turning, a highly skilled woman, both enthusiastic and eager to pass on her knowledge. As well as patiently teaching me how to use the lathe, she explained the intricacies of the piecework system, how the bonus payments were calculated, the rate of bonus I should seek to achieve, and the importance of not being greedy. If I consistently produce work at a speed sufficient to be paid a bonus above 200% of the going bonus rate, the rate fixers would descend on me like a flock of crows, stopwatches in hand, time my operations and reduce the agreed time for completing the job as a reward for my efficiency. Thus, as a result of my greed, the time allowed to complete the job would be reduced, bonus payments would be slashed, and all workers would suffer accordingly. She insisted that I produce work to a consistent and high standard of quality and accuracy, and taught me the best way to go about it. Maggie obviously took pride in her labour, and her infectious and positive attitude encouraged me to take pride in my own work. I owe her, and many others who followed on after her, more than I can ever hope to express in words. Maggie was not just a skilled machine tool operative, but, as I was to learn later, a political activist, a communist, the first one I ever met, and not a bit like the caricature of communists I had ever read or heard about. She had dark auburn hair, the rich red colour of her politics. People at that time talked about reds under the bed. To put it crudely, Maggie was a red many would love to have in their bed. She had a profound commitment to the democratic process and an unshakable belief in the potential of working people. This in turn inspired her communist principles, which were reinforced by an equally strong belief that the democracy our working class ancestors had fought so hard and long for remained a poor stunted child, a pale shadow of what it might grow up to be if it were provided with the necessary protection, nourishment and nurture. She argued that until democracy was extended into the economic sphere as well as the political, we would not achieve any real progress in society. She never pushed her political views onto me, although she did teach me a lot of useful things and was infinitely patient in answering my many and varied questions. She was fond of quotations, but despite her politics, I never remember her quoting Lenin or Stalin, or even Karl Marx. She recited the poet Shelley and quoted the novelist Elizabeth Gaskell, and sometimes referred to the wisdom of the young Tory Disraeli. She suggested I should read his novels Sybil and Coningsby, but it was many years later before I did. Nonetheless, when the time came to move on to a new department, I left her care a far wiser, much more confident youngster. She also presented me with a book, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist by Robert Tressel. Maggie taught me that the ability to make and to plan the utilisation of tools, whether it be to win food for nourishment, to provide shelter from the elements, to till the soil, to extract minerals from the bowels of the earth, and to transform those minerals into useful things, is the defining feature of the human species. It distinguishes us from all other animals, and remains the source of potential human wealth and of human art. Today, in 2014, we are constantly bombarded with the idea that we should value the activities of bankers and financiers, entrepreneurs and others, because they are the key wealth producers. What nonsense! What fairy tales! What wicked and downright lies the supposedly great and the good spread amongst us! They insult our intelligence and expect us to swallow their fabrications as if we were naive children brought up on stories of Father Christmas, believing such tales simply because our parents related them to us. As William Petty, the founder of English economics, pointed out in the 17th century, human labour is the father of all wealth, and nature is its mother. His findings were verified by numerous economists from a variety of backgrounds and with differing political outlooks. Adam Smith in the 18th century, Karl Marx in the 19th, and John Maynard Keynes in the 20th amongst them. They disagreed on many other things, but they all agreed on that. I am still waiting for anybody to put up a half-decent argument to refute Petty's scientific findings on this question. Unfortunately, in 1960, although I had long given up on Father Christmas, I remained extremely naive on the subject of political economy. My experiences in the factory and my interactions with its inhabitants, managers and workers alike, would eventually change that, but first things first. Before we leave the company of Red Maggie, I should point out that she did not benefit financially from the time, care and attention she gave me or any other apprentice. She didn't receive extra pay for passing on her expertise, quite the reverse. She still had to work to produce the bonus required to supplement her own meagre basic rate, and any time devoted to my needs was productive time lost to her own. The fact she never begrudged this situation speaks for itself. It should also be borne in mind that a skilled woman worker, who had served exactly the same apprenticeship as a man, only received about 80% of the skilled male rate of pay. This tradition, common throughout all manufacturing industries, was and is based on another establishment-inspired fairy tale, namely that women only work for pin money. The employers argued that a woman, unlike a man, didn't have the responsibility of being the head of the household. Despite my lack of political understanding, I knew this particular story was a myth, not least because I'd been brought up in a household headed by women. All the capstan lathe operators at the factory in 1960 were female. All had started work at the age of 14 during the years of the war against fascism, stepping in to undertake the labour of men who'd volunteered to fight. At the end of the war, they'd remained at work either because they were single or because, like Maggie, they had become the family breadwinners. I discovered later Maggie's father, like my dad, had been at Arnhem. Unlike my dad, a Nazi machine gunner had deprived him of both legs. The women machinists did similar work to that undertaken by the male machine operatives. They performed their tasks as efficiently as the men, and to the same high standards as the men. Clearly, they should have been paid the same rate of wages as the men, and I, young and naive as I was, found it scandalous that they weren't. It offended the sense of fair play inculcated in my mind by my aunts, and contradicted their teachings that the labourer was worthy of his, or, in this case, her hire. To make matters worse, I was dismayed and angered that most of the women's male colleagues didn't seem to care. Issues like this began to nag at my mind. I began to question the status quo. The disparity between women's and men's pay wasn't the only issue offending and exercising my innocent mind as a result of my entry into the world of work, nor was it the first unpleasant surprise I experienced. That had taken place the moment I entered my dad's new abode. 22 Belper Street was a typical working-class terraced house in the Gorton of that time. The front door opened straight onto the pavement of gritstone flags. It consisted of 2 downstairs rooms, a small front room, designated as the parlour, and an even smaller living room, its width reduced in order to accommodate a steep flight of stairs, providing access to a front and a rear bedroom, the latter being mine. Attached to the downstairs living room was a small wooden lean-to, just wide enough to contain a small wall cupboard. Below it stood a narrow table for preparing food, and next to that an electric stove and hob with 3 rings. On the opposite side of a passage, just wide enough for one person to squeeze through, was a stone sink with a draining board and a single cold water tap. Dad hadn't lived there very long, and he informed me that an Ascot gas water heater was due to be fitted. In the meantime, we had to use the electric kettle for all our hot water. This was our sole means of washing. This lean-to, which Dad proudly called the kitchenette, had 2 doors. One accessed a small outdoor toilet, brick-built with a sloping gritstone roof, abutting the main wall of the house at the side of the small sash window, which provided some daylight to the living room. The other kitchenette door provided access to the back gate, and the rest of the concreted backyard, which was surrounded by a high brick wall, and the main area of which was occupied by a state-of-the-art, bang-up-to-date air-raid shelter, again brick-built and capped with a 12-inch thick reinforced concrete roof. This was used as a coal shed. It was better built, less damp, and occupied far more space than the kitchenette. The compact living and sleeping space provided did not present a major problem to either Dad or me. The house felt fairly cosy and didn't require much of a fire to keep warm, but it was damp. There was no damp course, and the wall under the window in the parlour was incapable of bearing wallpaper without it becoming soaked through and stained within a week of decoration. A relatively small amount of construction work would have set the house to rights, but it was a rented house, and private landlords were as tight as the proverbial duck's anus, and duck's anuses, unlike our front wall, were and remain watertight. I found these living conditions shocking, having been brought up in houses with internal bathrooms and toilets. I found it even more shocking to discover that over 2/3 of Manchester's housing stock at that time lacked these basic facilities. Despite the demise of the cotton industry, the city remained the commercial centre of one of the major wealth-producing areas of Britain, and in those days Britain was the 3rd richest country in the world. My naturally rebellious spirit drew nourishment from the situation. like a rose bush blooming in soil laced with horse shit. I didn't understand why hard-working people should be housed in such conditions, and I didn't understand why they should be willing to put up with it. The simple fact of life confronting me was that number 22 Belper Street was a slum, and I, up to that point in time, had the curious notion that slums were inhabited by the feckless, the hopeless, the careless, the lazy, and the downright stupid. At the same time, I knew my hard-working and honest dad fitted into none of those categories any more than I did, and yet both of us now inhabited number 22. It began to dawn on me there were tens of thousands in the same situation. Many of them had families with 2 and 3 or more children, all cramped into these tiny dwellings and reliant on the municipal baths for their weekly bathe. Increasingly I began to realise I inhabited a world riven with division and inequality, a world of substantial wealth, blemished by great poverty, both at home and abroad. And those who lived in poverty tended to be those who laboured the hardest to survive. One particular morning I was suddenly interrupted from my work. "You're Norman's son, aren't you?" I looked around at my questioner. A tall man in the familiar brown coat of a supervisor stood before me. "I'm the foreman of the transformer department. You are Norman's lad, aren't you?" "Yes. Is something wrong? Dad's not had an accident, has he?" The supervisor laughed. "Your dad's fine. No, I need your help, son." I felt flattered. Why should this superior being require my help? I asked the obvious question. "What can I do for you?" "Could you nip down to the stores and get me these, lad?" He slipped me a piece of paper. It required 24 2x8 by 1 inch brass cheesehead screws, 24 2x8 brass nuts, together with the same number of associated plane and lock washers. "Yes, I can get you these, but I'll need a requisition, chitty." "No, son, just give your dad this note and tell him they're for me. It will be fine, don't worry." I'm not sure why, but I had a strange feeling there was something suspicious going on. I reacted accordingly. "I'm sorry, I can't do it without a chitty." "Malc, I'm a foreman. Do as you're told." "I'm sorry," I retorted, becoming bolshy. "I couldn't care less if you were Lord Chandos himself. I'm not going for those nuts and screws without an official requisition slip. Get me one, and I'll be there and back in no time." Lord Chandos was the chairman of the board of AEI. Absolutely furious, the factory policeman disappeared back to his own department. As I began to turn to my job once more, Maggie caught my eye. She crooked her finger, indicating she wanted to see me. I walked over to her. "What did the deacon want? He seemed to be giving you some hassle." I explained. "So, what did you tell him?" "I made it clear I'd only get them if he gave me a signed chitty. Did I do wrong?" Maggie laughed. "No, not at all. You did exactly the right thing. There's only one reason he won't give you a requisition slip. He had no right to have the screws in the first place. He obviously wanted them for his own private use. There's too much bloody theft in the factory, Malc, a trap all too many workers fall into. A foreman should know better." She smiled at me. "More importantly, it could have been a try-on." "What do you mean?" "He could have been setting you or your dad up for disciplinary action. I doubt it in this instance, but you never know. Norman's a shop steward, and although he's a bit of a softy, he can and has created problems for the management when defending somebody suffering unfair treatment. Any shop steward has to watch their P's and Q's if they value their job." I frowned and nodded, understanding her logic. "I hadn't really thought it through, Maggie. I just asked myself, what would Auntie Dolly do?" Maggie laughed. "Good for Auntie Dolly. I'm really pleased you reacted the way you did. You showed integrity along with a willingness to stand up to somebody misusing their authority. I have great hopes for you, my love." Maggie's praise was music to my ears, but there was something else. I had no idea until that moment that Dad was a trade unionist, let alone a shop steward. I knew Auntie Dolly was a trade unionist, but then I'd always known she was a bit of a firebrand. She could start an argument in an empty paper bag. My dad's personality was completely different. He was so gentle and patient, I didn't think he'd say boo to a goose. I obviously had a lot to learn about him. In fact, it was slowly dawning on me I had a lot to learn about just everything. Another thought struck me. Why did you call him the deacon? He's a God-botherer. I nodded. The foreman was obviously a hypocrite. I've met many sincere and good Christians, but I've met all too many from the same sect as the deacon as well. Despite these revelations and the affronts to my sense of justice and fair play, all was far from negative. I took to work and factory life like a duck takes to water. The factory provided a new and exciting environment, inhabited by 1,300 people, and I soon felt a part of it and part of them. I discovered very early on that despite his lowly position in the overall scheme of things, Dad was much admired and genuinely respected. To what degree this determined his fellow workers' attitude to me, I cannot be sure, but it can't have done me any disservice. I too was treated with respect, and quickly made to feel one of the family. When I talked about my experiences to my aunts and friends in Marble, I automatically used terms like my lathe or our works. The company's shareholders might have thought the factory belonged to them, but what did they know? Didn't take me long to realise they never set foot in the place, and I had no doubt there were very few of them who possessed the faintest inkling of the mysteries and crafts involved in the manufacture of high and medium voltage electrical switchgear. Indeed, I realised most of them were no doubt ignorant of the basic function of electrical switchgear. They might have had expertise in the art of wealth accumulation, but enjoyed little understanding of the nature of wealth production, let alone any respect for those who produced it. But to be fair, why should they? If you have sufficient capital to live on the labour of others, you are hardly likely to labour yourself, any more than you'd own a dog and do your own barking. I've never been brilliant or anywhere near my best first thing in the morning, but I found myself enjoying the simple act of travelling to and entering the factory at 7:20 every morning. I looked forward to the ceremony of preparing and consuming the morning pre-work brew. I took pleasure in the donning of overalls and the preparation for work. I delighted in the wail of the hooter, signalling the start of the working day, and anticipated the prospect of learning something new with relish. In this regard I never suffered disappointment. My brain soaked up knowledge and thirsted for more. The initial excitement I'd felt when first experiencing the sights and sounds of the factory coming to life, like some sleek, sinuous beast awakening from its slumbers, never waned.